The throne room of Velthara sparkled like 1,000 diamonds had been pressed into its walls, and the light from 3 suns streamed through crystal windows that stood taller than any building on earth, and Queen Lysandra sat upon her throne carved from a single piece of living opal that pulsed with soft blue light, and her silver hair flowed down her shoulders like liquid moonlight, and her violet eyes held the weight of 3,000 years of rule. And she was beautiful in the way that ancient things are beautiful and terrifying, in the way that immortal beings can be terrifying, because they have seen empires crumble and stars die, and yet they remain unchanged and unbowed. At the base of her throne lay Nethys, and the dragon was massive beyond human comprehension, and his scales shifted between midnight blue and deep purple, depending on how the light caught them, and his wings were folded against his body, but even folded they stretched across half the throne room, and his golden eyes watched everything with an intelligence that predated most civilizations in the galaxy, and when he breathed, the air shimmered with heat and power. The doors to the throne room opened with a sound like singing metal, and the Veltharan guards stepped aside to let the human delegation enter, and they looked so small compared to the grandeur of the room, and so fragile compared to the elven warriors who stood twice their height and carried weapons that could turn matter into light. And Commander Lisa Morgan led the group, and she wore the dark blue uniform of Earth Strategic Alliance, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her green eyes were calm and professional, and she carried a data tablet under one arm. Lysandra barely glanced at them, and for 3,000 years she had received ambassadors and supplicants and conquerors, and they all looked the same after a while, and these humans were newcomers to the galactic community and barely worth her attention, and their war had been a minor inconvenience, and her generals had assured her that the treaty was simply a formality between equals, and she had signed it without reading every detail, because what could these young species possibly demand from an empire that had ruled 100 star systems before humanity had invented the wheel? Lisa walked forward with measured steps, and she did not bow, and she did not show any sign of being impressed by the Crystal Palace, or the ancient queen or the dragon that could swallow her whole, and she simply stopped at the prescribed distance, and activated her data tablet, and a holographic document appeared in the air between them, and it glowed with soft blue light and showed page after page of dense legal text. Commander Lisa Morgan spoke, and her voice was clear and steady and carried across the vast throne room without effort, and she said that she brought greetings from Earth and from the Strategic Alliance, and that she was here to fulfill the terms of the Treaty of Arcturus, and Queen Lysandra waved one elegant hand in acknowledgement, and said that the treaty was acceptable, and that peace between their peoples would be maintained, and she expected this to be a short ceremonial visit. But Lisa did not leave, and instead, she expanded the holographic document and highlighted a specific section, and she read aloud in a voice that did not waver, and she said that, according to Clause 7, subsection 12 of the treaty, all Veltharan military operations and all territorial expansion and all diplomatic negotiations must receive approval from the assigned human oversight officer. And she paused and let those words sink into the ancient stones of the throne room. And then she said that she was that officer, and that she would be overseeing all such operations effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, and even Nethys lifted his massive head and his golden eyes fixed on the human with new interest, and Queen Lysandra remained perfectly still, but her knuckles had gone white where they gripped the arms of her throne, and when she spoke, her voice was like ice cracking on a frozen lake, and she asked Lisa to repeat what she had just said. Lisa repeated it word for word, and she explained that during the peace negotiations, Earth Strategic Alliance had proven their tactical superiority in unconventional warfare and had demonstrated capabilities that the Veltharan Empire had not anticipated, and as a condition of peace, humanity had negotiated oversight privileges to ensure that neither side would have cause for future conflict, and she said all of this in the same calm, professional tone as if she were discussing weather patterns instead of telling a 3,000-year-old queen that she now answered to a human officer who had been alive for barely 3 decades. Lysandra stood, and when she stood, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Nethys unfurled his wings, and they blotted out the light from the windows and cast the throne room into shadow. And his breath came out in wisps of smoke and flame, and the dragon was preparing to defend his queen, and the Veltharan guards raised their weapons, and the crystal walls hummed with building energy. But Lisa did not move, and she did not reach for any weapon, and she simply looked up at the queen and the dragon. And she said that any act of aggression against her or her team would constitute a violation of the treaty, and would result in immediate sanctions and potential military intervention. And she said that Earth had 16 battle cruisers in orbit around Velthara right now, and that they were currently running stealth protocols, but could be made visible if the Queen wished to verify their presence. Queen Lysandra closed her eyes, and she reached out with her mind to her military commanders, and she felt their thoughts touch hers across the distance, and she asked them if this was true, and they confirmed that yes, there were human ships in orbit, and yes, they had managed to approach completely undetected, and yes, the treaty did contain those clauses, and they had not thought to mention it because surely the humans would not actually enforce such terms against an empire as powerful as Velthara. The Queen opened her eyes and looked at Lisa Morgan, and she saw in that human face something she had not expected to see. And it was not cruelty or triumph or smugness, and it was simply determination and duty, and the kind of tiredness that comes from carrying heavy responsibilities. And Lysandra realized with dawning horror that this human actually intended to do this job and intended to do it well, and that made her far more dangerous than any conqueror. Lysandra sat back down, and she dismissed her guards with a gesture, and Nethys folded his wings, but did not take his eyes off the humans, and the Queen asked how this had happened and how her own council had signed away her sovereignty. Without her knowledge, Lisa explained that the Veltharan negotiators had been focused on military terms and territorial boundaries and resource rights, and they had spent weeks arguing over the placement of border stations and the limitation of fleet sizes, and somewhere in the middle of page 473, they had agreed to human oversight, as what they assumed was a minor administrative detail, and they had been too proud to ask for clarification and too certain of their own superiority to imagine that humans would actually use that power. The Queen was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet and cold, and she said that Lisa and her team could stay in the palace as required by the treaty, but that they would receive no cooperation and no courtesy and no access to anything beyond what was legally mandated. And she said that the Veltharan Empire had endured for millennia and would endure long after humanity had faded into dust. Lisa nodded, and she said that she understood and that she would be moving into the East Wing tomorrow, and that they had a lot of work to do together. And then she bowed slightly and turned and walked out of the throne room with her team following behind her. When the humans were gone, Nethys spoke, and his voice was like rocks grinding together deep underground. And he asked Lysandra what she intended to do, and the Queen stared at the space where Lisa had stood, and she said that she would find a way to break this treaty and to remove these humans from her empire, and she would do it legally if possible, and by force if necessary. But even as she said it, she wondered if it would be that simple, because Lisa Morgan had not looked like someone who could be easily removed, and there had been something in those calm green eyes that suggested the human had prepared for every possible response, including violence. And Lysandra had ruled for 3,000 years by knowing when to fight and when to wait, and right now she did not know which choice would serve her people better. The 3 suns set beyond the crystal windows and the throne room filled with shadows, and Queen Lysandra sat in the darkness and plotted her next move. Lisa Morgan moved into the east wing of the palace the next morning, and she brought very little with her, because she had learned long ago that traveling light meant staying flexible, and her aide, Lieutenant Amy Barnes, helped her unpack, and Amy was young and bright, and had a mind like a tactical computer, and she could predict political moves 3 steps ahead, and Lisa trusted her completely. The Veltharan servants assigned to their wing did the absolute minimum required, and they brought food. But it was cold, and they cleaned the rooms, but not well, and they spoke only when directly questioned, and their answers were short and hostile. And Lisa accepted this without complaint because she had expected nothing less, and she knew that respect had to be earned, especially from a people who measured their history in millennia, while humanity measured theirs in centuries. Queen Lysandra began her campaign of resistance immediately, and she conducted all council meetings in ancient Veltharan, and it was a language that predated human contact by thousands of years, and the grammar was high complex, and the vocabulary was vast, and she assumed that no human could possibly have learned it in the short time since first contact. But when Lisa attended her first council meeting and the queen spoke in ancient Veltharan, Lisa responded in the same language, and her accent was not perfect, but her grammar was solid, and she quoted from the verses of Kaleth, which was one of the oldest philosophical texts in Veltharan culture, and the council members stared at her in shock, and Lysandra felt something like anger and something like grudging respect. The queen demanded to know how Lisa had learned their language, and Lisa explained that she had spent the past year studying it, and not just the modern diplomatic version, but the classical forms and the poetry and the songs, and she had read the chronicles of the First War and the meditations of Queen Vareth and the cantos of Starfall, and she spoke about them with genuine appreciation and understanding. Lysandra felt her carefully constructed wall of disdain crack just slightly, because this human had done something that very few outsiders ever attempted, and she had learned not just to speak Veltharan, but to understand the culture and the history and the values that shaped it, and that showed a level of dedication that the queen had not anticipated. But the real battle came 3 weeks later when General Theron presented a military proposal to the council, and he was Lysandra's most trusted commander, and he had fought beside her for 800 years. And he proposed a defensive operation to reclaim a border system from the Kralvin, and the insectoid species had moved into the system after the Veltharans abandoned it during a plague 6 centuries ago, and technically it was still Veltharan territory, and reclaiming it was a matter of honor. The council debated for hours, and the arguments were passionate and eloquent, and finally they voted to approve the operation, and Lysandra gave her blessing, and the fleet would move within the week, and it seemed like a settled matter. Then Lisa stood, and she said that she could not approve the operation, and the room went silent, and General Theron turned to look at her with barely contained fury, and he demanded to know by what right a human who had only achieved faster than light travel 2 centuries ago could dictate military terms to an empire that had been conquering star systems since before Earth had cities. Lisa did not flinch, and she activated a holographic display and showed tactical maps of the border region, and she highlighted Veltharan supply lines and fleet positions and enemy territory, and she explained that the proposed operation would overextend their resources and leave 3 other border systems vulnerable, and she showed how the Kralvin had been deliberately abandoning systems to lure enemies into overreach and then striking at weakened positions, and she pulled up 6 historical examples of this exact tactic working against other species. She demonstrated that the Kralvin had been fortifying the system for the past decade, and that a direct assault would cost the Veltharans between 40% and 60% casualties, and even if they won, the system was too far from established supply routes to hold effectively, and within a year, the Kralvin would take it back, and the Veltharans would have spent lives and resources for nothing. The council was silent, and General Theron looked at the tactical displays, and his expression shifted from anger to concentration, and he asked Lisa what she would suggest instead. Lisa offered 3 alternative approaches, and the first was a diplomatic overture to the Kralvin, offering a trade agreement that would give them something they needed more than the disputed system. And the second was a covert operation to establish listening posts in nearby systems that would give the Veltharans intelligence advantage without committing to open warfare. And the third was a long-term plan to strengthen adjacent systems until the disputed territory became strategically isolated and worthless. Each approach achieved the goal of securing Veltharan interests without the massive cost of direct assault, and General Theron studied them carefully, and he grudgingly admitted that they had merit, and the council voted again, and this time they approved one of Lisa's alternatives, and Lysandra said nothing but her eyes were thoughtful. That night, Nethys left his position by the throne and walked through the palace corridors, and servants scattered before him, because a dragon moving with purpose was something to fear, and he made his way to the east wing, and stood outside Lisa's door, and his massive form blocked the hallway. Lisa opened the door, and she looked up at the dragon, and showed no fear. And Nethys spoke in his rumbling voice that shook the stone walls, and he asked why she served her duty so completely when the Veltharans clearly despised her presence. Lisa considered the question, and she invited Nethys into her room, and the dragon had to fold himself small to fit through the door, and he settled on the floor and waited for her answer. She said that the treaty was not about humiliation, and it was not about control, and it was about preventing the next war, and she explained that Earth had nearly destroyed itself in the resource wars, and billions had died because nations refused to work together and refused to accept help and refused to admit when they were wrong, and humanity had learned at terrible cost that pride was expensive and cooperation was survival. She said that the Veltharan Empire was powerful and ancient and impressive, but even powerful things could fall if they made the wrong choices, and her job was not to rule over them, but to be a voice that asked difficult questions and challenged assumptions and prevented the kind of arrogance that led to catastrophe. Nethys listened, and his golden eyes studied her, and he said that he had lived for 4,000 years, and had seen many species rise and fall, and very few of them had the wisdom to learn from their mistakes, and fewer still had the courage to help others avoid the same mistakes, and he said that perhaps she was not the enemy after all. The dragon left, and Lisa closed her door and sat in the darkness of her room and wondered if she was making any progress at all. From her balcony high above the palace, Lysandra had watched Nethys visit the human quarters, and when the dragon returned to her chambers, she asked what he had learned. Nethys said that Lisa Morgan was exactly what she appeared to be, and she was a soldier who believed in her mission, and who would not be swayed by threats or bribery or flattery, and she was dangerous not because she was cruel, but because she was competent and honest. Lysandra stood at her window and looked out over her empire, and she thought about the council meeting and about how Lisa had been right and about how easy it would have been to launch that operation and lose thousands of lives for nothing. She wondered if having someone to challenge her decisions might not be entirely terrible, and then she pushed that thought away because accepting the treaty meant accepting that her empire needed oversight, and that was a truth she was not ready to face. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and in the weeks that followed, she found herself watching Lisa more carefully and listening to her suggestions, even when she did not want to, and slowly, the absolute certainty that the human must be removed began to shift into something more complex and more uncertain. The battle of wills continued, but the lines were no longer as clear as they had been. 3 months passed, and the palace settled into an uneasy rhythm, and Lisa attended council meetings and reviewed military proposals, and slowly the Veltharan officials stopped treating her like an invader and started treating her like a permanent fixture. And it was not friendship, but it was not open hostility either. And that was progress. The state dinner was held in the grand hall, and crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 3 stories high, and tables were laden with delicacies from 100 worlds. and Queen Lysandra wore robes of silver thread that caught the light like captured starlight, and she sat at the head of the longest table, and Lisa sat 6 places down on her right side, and Amy sat across from her, and the dinner was meant to celebrate a trade agreement with the Mathara collective servants brought course after course. And the Veltharan nobles made polite conversation, and Lisa noticed that Lysandra had barely touched her food, and the queen seemed distracted, and her violet eyes kept scanning the room as if looking for something. Then Lysandra lifted her wine glass and took a single sip, and her expression changed, and Lisa saw the queen's hand tremble, and saw her pupils dilate, and recognized the signs of poisoning from her emergency medical training. Lisa moved without thinking, and she launched herself across the table and knocked the wine glass from Lysandra's hand, and it shattered on the marble floor, and purple liquid spread like blood, and Lisa shouted for Amy to seal the room, and tackled the queen to the ground and covered her body with her own. Nethys erupted from his resting place near the throne, and his roar shattered 3 of the crystal chandeliers. And guards poured into the room with weapons raised, and chaos erupted as nobles screamed and ran for exits. And Amy had already activated the emergency protocols and energy barriers, sealed every door and window. Lisa pressed her fingers to Lysandra's throat and felt her pulse racing too fast, and saw sweat breaking out on her pale skin, and knew that she had maybe 3 minutes before the poison stopped her heart. And Lisa pulled an emergency medical kit from her jacket, and inside was an antidote synthesizer that she had insisted on carrying after spending weeks studying Veltharan biology. She loaded a sample of the queen's blood into the device, and it analyzed the toxin and calculated the appropriate countermeasure. And Lisa injected it directly into Lysandra's arm and held her steady as the antidote fought the poison, and the queen's body convulsed and then slowly relaxed. Lysandra opened her eyes and looked up at the human who was still covering her body and protecting her from further attack, and she tried to speak, but Lisa told her to stay quiet and let the medicine work. The guards searched every servant and every noble in the room, and they found nothing, and the assassins had already escaped, and Amy coordinated with Veltharan security to lock down the palace and review surveillance footage and trace the poison back to its source. Lisa stayed with Lysandra until the royal physicians arrived, and they examined their queen and confirmed that she would have died within minutes if not for the humans' quick response, and they looked at Lisa with new respect, and perhaps a little shame that they had not been the ones to save their ruler. The investigation began immediately, and Lisa and Amy worked alongside Veltharan intelligence officers, and they discovered that the poison was a rare toxin called Nethrus root, and it only affected elven physiology and would have been undetectable to standard food testing protocols, and someone had known exactly what they were doing. The trail led to a group calling themselves the Purity Circle, and they were Veltharan nobles who believed that the treaty had stained their honor, and that accepting human oversight was worse than death, and they had decided that if Lysandra would not break the treaty, then she must be removed and replaced with someone who would. But as Lisa and Amy dug deeper, they found something strange, and the Purity Circle had funding far beyond what their membership should provide, and they had access to military intelligence that should have been classified, and they had made contact with off-world arms dealers and were purchasing weapons that made no sense for a simple assassination plot. Lisa brought her findings to Lysandra, and the queen had recovered enough to sit in her private study, and Nethys lay beside her chair and watched Lisa with thoughtful golden eyes. Lisa explained that the assassination was not just about the treaty, and someone was using the Purity Circle as a cover for something larger, and she showed financial records that indicated massive embezzlement from imperial accounts, and showed communication logs that suggested someone was selling Veltharan military technology to enemy states. Lysandra studied the evidence, and her expression grew dark, and she asked who could possibly have access to all of these systems and all of this sensitive information. Lisa pulled up a final document, and It showed a pattern of authorization codes and security clearances, and they all traced back to one person, and Lord Vacris, who was Lysandra's cousin and the Minister of Colonial Affairs and one of the most powerful nobles in the empire. The queen was silent for a long time, and then she said that Vacris had always been ambitious, and had always resented that she had been chosen to rule instead of him, and he had supported the war with humanity and had promised that it would be an easy victory that would expand the empire and increase his political influence. Lisa said that the war had not gone as Vacris expected, and humanity had fought to a stalemate and forced peace negotiations, and she believed that Vacris had deliberately manipulated the treaty terms to include clauses that would enrage the nobility and destabilize Lysandra's rule, and with the queen weakened or dead, he could seize power. But proving it would be difficult, and Vacris had covered his tracks well, and he had allies throughout the government, and any direct accusation without absolute proof would tear the empire apart in civil war. Lysandra looked at Lisa, and for the first time there was no hostility in her violet eyes, and she asked what the human suggested. Lisa proposed something that had never been done before, and she suggested a joint task force with human and Veltharan agents working together to gather evidence. And she said that her people had intelligence-gathering techniques that might find what Veltharan methods had missed, and in return, Veltharan agents could access areas where humans would be noticed. The queen considered this, and she looked at Nethys, and the dragon rumbled his approval, and Lysandra nodded and said that they would work together, and that she was trusting Lisa not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Lisa said that trust was a start and that she would not let the queen down. They assembled a team in secret, and Amy coordinated intelligence from human sources, while Veltharan agents loyal to Lysandra worked from within, and they began tracking financial transactions and monitoring communications and following Lord Vacris's network of conspirators. Over the following weeks, Lisa and Lysandra spent long hours together reviewing evidence and planning operations, and the walls between them continued to break down, and during one late-night session, Lysandra shared stories of the Empire's golden age and of battles fought when she and Nethys were both young and the stars were full of promise. Lisa shared her own stories of Earth and of the resource wars and of how humanity had learned that survival required cooperation instead of domination, and she talked about the billions who had died because nations could not put aside their pride. Lysandra listened, and she began to understand that the treaty was not about humiliation, and it was about preventing her people from making the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed Earth. The investigation finally led them to a hidden facility on the moon of Kael'thos, and surveillance showed shipments of stolen weapons and encrypted communications with Kralvan hive minds and evidence that Vacris was building a private army. They had found their proof, but confronting Vacris would require careful planning and absolute secrecy, and one wrong move would trigger the very civil war. They were trying to prevent. Nethys spoke privately to Lysandra that night, and he said that he had observed Lisa Morgan carefully, and that the human had the heart of a warrior queen regardless of her species, and that perhaps the treaty had brought them something valuable. After all, Lysandra did not respond, but she did not deny it either, and she stood at her window and looked out at the stars, and wondered when exactly she had stopped seeing Lisa as an enemy and started seeing her as an ally. The task force gathered in a secure location deep beneath the palace, and Lisa stood before a holographic display showing the facility on Kael'thos, and the moon was a desolate rock with toxic atmosphere, and the only reason to build there was secrecy, and Vacris had chosen. Well, Amy presented the intelligence they had gathered, and there were at least 200 mercenaries guarding that facility, and automated defense systems and enough firepower to hold off a small fleet, and getting in would require precision timing, and getting out would require even more luck. Lysandra had selected 6 of her most trusted warriors, and they were veterans who had fought beside her for centuries, and they regarded Lisa and Amy with professional courtesy instead of contempt, and that was progress. But they still did not fully trust the humans. Lisa outlined the mission plan, and they would use a human stealth shuttle to approach because Veltharan ships were too well known and might trigger alarms, and they would insert under cover of a radiation storm that swept across Kelthos every 72 hours and would have exactly 4 hours to get in and get the evidence and get out before the storm ended and their presence was detected. Nethys would provide air support if needed, but they hoped to complete the mission without alerting anyone, and the dragon was too large to hide, and his presence would announce their arrival to everyone within 100 kilometers. They launched at midnight, and the stealth shuttle cut through space like a shadow, and Lisa piloted it herself because she had trained for covert insertion operations, and Amy monitored sensors and watched for patrol ships, and the Veltharan warriors checked their weapons and prepared for combat. The radiation storm hit Kelthos right on schedule, and it turned the moon's already hostile atmosphere into a swirling nightmare of electromagnetic interference and deadly particles, and Lisa brought the shuttle down in the lee of a crater wall, and they had landed 3 kilometers from the facility. They moved across the surface in environment suits, and the Veltharan warriors were graceful even in the bulky gear, and Lisa led them through the toxic landscape, and they reached the facility's outer perimeter without being detected. Amy hacked the security system using methods that made the Veltharan technicians in the group look impressed, and they slipped inside through a maintenance entrance and found themselves in a corridor lined with crates of weapons, and the evidence was everywhere. But then alarms started blaring and red lights flooded the corridors, and Lisa realized they had walked into a trap, and Vakris had anticipated their investigation and had prepared an ambush. Energy shields activated and cut them off from their shuttle, and blast doors sealed behind them and trapped them in the central section of the facility, and mercenaries poured in from both directions. And Lisa and her team took cover behind the weapon crates and returned fire. A holographic projection appeared, and Lord Vakris smiled down at them, and he was a tall elven noble with features similar to Lysandra, but colder and more cruel, and he congratulated them on finding his facility and said that it was unfortunate they would not live to report what they found. He revealed his plan with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won, and he explained that he had made a deal with the Kralvan, and in exchange for Veltharan military technology, the insectoids would support his coup, and once he controlled the Empire, he would tear up the treaty and finish the war with humanity, and this time, with overwhelming force. The facility began to self-destruct, and explosions rocked the corridors, and Lisa's team fought their way toward the reactor chamber because it was the most heavily shielded part of the facility and their best chance of survival. They were pinned down by automated turrets and mercenary fire and taking casualties, and one of the Veltharan warriors went down with a blast to the shoulder, and another was hit in the leg, and they were running out of options. Then the ceiling exploded inward, and crystal and metal rained down, and Nethys crashed through the facility dome in a shower of debris, and his massive form filled the reactor chamber, and his golden eyes blazed with fury. Lysandra sat on the dragon's back, and she wore combat armor that gleamed like starlight and carried a blade that hummed with energy, and she looked like the warrior queen she had been 1,000 years ago. Nethys unleashed his breath weapon, and plasma fire hotter than ship engines swept through the corridor and turned automated defenses into molten slag, and cleared a path through the mercenaries. Lisa rallied her team, and they fought toward the dragon, and Lysandra leaped down from Nethys's back and fought beside Lisa, and the humans' tactical training complemented the elf's millennia of combat experience. A mercenary's blade came for Lisa, and Lysandra's sword intercepted it and turned it aside, and the queen drove her blade through the attacker's chest, and Lisa covered her with suppressing fire and took down 2 more enemies who were trying to flank them. An energy barrier blocked their path, and Lisa pulled a demolition charge from her pack and placed it against the barrier and blew it apart, and they poured through the gap. Nethys provided devastating air support, and his roars shook the foundation of the facility, and his claws tore through walls and defenses, and his tail swept aside entire groups of mercenaries. They reached the data core, and Amy downloaded everything while the others held the perimeter, and the facility was coming apart around them, and explosions were getting closer, and they had maybe 2 minutes before the reactor went critical. They ran for the breach in the dome that Nethys had created, and the dragon grabbed them in his massive claws and launched himself into the toxic sky, and behind them, the facility exploded in a ball of white fire that lit up the entire moon. They escaped with the evidence. But Vacris had already fled in a stealth ship, and by the time they returned to Velthara, he was broadcasting across the Empire. His message played on every channel, and he claimed that Lysandra had been corrupted by human influence and that she had ordered an attack on loyal Veltharan citizens who opposed the treaty, and he called for the nobility to rise up and remove her from power. The Empire teetered on the edge of civil war, and noble houses began choosing sides, and fleet commanders demanded clarification, and some systems threatened to secede rather than follow a queen they believed had betrayed them. Aboard the human frigate Meridian, as it raced back to Velthara, Lisa and Lysandra sat in the briefing room and reviewed their options, and they had the evidence, but presenting it would be difficult because Vacris had poisoned the court of public opinion. Amy suggested that they leak the evidence through unofficial channels, but Lysandra said that would make them look desperate and guilty. Lisa made a decision and said that she would invoke Clause 9 of the treaty, and the provision allowed the human oversight officer to testify as a neutral arbiter in matters of imperial succession, and she would present the evidence before the Grand Council, and her testimony would carry the weight of Earth Strategic Alliance. Lysandra looked at the human who had saved her life twice, and who had fought beside her, and who had proven herself worthy of respect, and the Queen said that if they survived this, she owed Lisa an apology, and that the human had never been the enemy. Lisa smiled and said that they should survive it first, and then Lysandra could buy her a drink. They approached Velthara and saw that both loyal and rebel fleets had gathered, and the space around the homeworld was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Nethys lay in the cargo bay, and his golden eyes watched them, and he said that whatever happened in the council chamber would determine the fate of the Empire and possibly the fate of the entire sector. Lisa checked her sidearm and reviewed her notes, and prepared to walk into the most hostile room she had ever faced, and she thought about all the decisions that had led her to this moment and wondered if she would live to regret any of them. Lysandra stood beside her, and for the first time they felt like true partners instead of reluctant allies, and they would face the Grand Council together and either save the Empire or watch it burn. The Grand Council chamber was vast enough to hold representatives from every major world in the Veltharan Empire, and the ceiling was carved from a single piece of crystal that showed the stars beyond, and rows of seats descended in tiers toward the central floor where accused and accuser would face judgment. The chamber was filled with nobles and military commanders and representatives from 100 worlds. And the tension was so thick, it seemed to press down like physical weight, and Vacris had rallied significant support, and his faction wore red sashes to identify themselves, and they were armed and ready for violence. The chamber was ringed with guards, both Veltharan and human, and the human peacekeepers wore full combat armor and carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, and everyone knew that one wrong move would trigger a bloodbath. Queen Lysandra entered first, and she wore her crown and royal robes, and walked with the dignity of 3,000 years of rule, and Nethys followed her, and his massive form barely fit through the chamber doors, and his presence reminded everyone that the queen was not defenseless. Lisa entered behind them, and she wore her dress uniform and carried only a data tablet, and she looked small compared to the elven nobles. But she walked with confidence and took her place at the central podium. Lord Vacris sat in the opposition section, and he smiled with cold certainty, and he had spent the past days building his case and turning public opinion against Lysandra, and he believed that victory was already his. The Chief Justice called the session to order, and the ancient Veltharan noble had presided over the Grand Council for 600 years, and his voice carried the weight of law and tradition, and he asked Lisa Morgan to present her evidence. Lisa activated her data tablet, and holographic displays filled the air above the council floor, and she began methodically and professionally and showed financial records that detailed Vakris's embezzlement and communication logs with Kralvin hive minds and testimony from captured mercenaries. She presented shipping manifests that showed stolen weapons and surveillance footage from the Kelthos facility, and banking records that traced millions of credits through shell companies and back to Vakris's personal accounts. But Vakris was a skilled orator, and he rose and objected to each piece of evidence and claimed it was human fabrication and part of a plot to control the empire through their puppet queen. And he spoke with passion and eloquence, and many in the chamber nodded in agreement. He painted a picture of Lysandra, corrupted by human influence and betraying her own people, and attacking loyal Veltharans who dared to oppose the treaty. And he said that Lisa Morgan had orchestrated everything to increase human control over the empire. The council was deadlocked, and half believed the evidence, and half believed Vakris, and the Chief Justice looked troubled because he could not make a ruling without consensus, and civil war seemed inevitable. Then Lysandra did something unprecedented in 3,000 years of rule, and she stood and removed her crown and set it on the table before her, and the entire chamber went silent. She spoke, and her voice carried across the vast space, and she said that she was not speaking as a queen, but as a soldier who had fought for her people for millennia, and she admitted that she had despised the treaty and despised Lisa, and despised humanity for daring to judge her empire. But she had learned something in the month since Lisa arrived, and she had learned that true strength was not refusing help, and it was recognizing when collaboration made you stronger, and she said that Lisa Morgan had saved her life and had fought beside her and had proven herself worthy of respect. She revealed Vakris's ultimate plan and explained that once he controlled the empire, he would have purged all non-Veltharan species from their territories and started a genocide that would dwarf any war in recorded history, and the Kralvin were not allies, but tools to be discarded once Vakris had absolute power. She said that Lisa's oversight was not about controlling the Veltharans, and it was about preventing monsters like Vakris from turning the empire into something unrecognizable, and she said that she had been wrong to resist it. The chamber erupted in debate, and nobles shouted at each other, and Vakris's supporters demanded proof, and Lysandra's supporters called for immediate arrest. Nethys had remained silent throughout the proceedings, but now he spoke, and his voice filled the chamber like thunder, and everyone fell silent, because a dragon's voice commanded respect. He said that he had lived for 4,000 years, and seen empires rise and fall and watched species destroy themselves through arrogance, and he declared that Lisa Morgan had proven herself worthy of her position through wisdom and courage and unwavering commitment to peace. He said that if the council rejected her testimony, they rejected truth itself, and he would not serve an empire that chose lies over honor. Vakris made his final desperate move, and he signaled to his armed supporters, and they rose with weapons drawn and called for the chamber to be seized. But his own soldiers hesitated when confronted with the combined presence of Lysandra and Nethys and the human peacekeepers and General Theron, who had been secretly working with Lisa's task force, stepped forward and declared for the queen. Other commanders followed, and Vakris's support collapsed in minutes, and his soldiers laid down their weapons, and he was arrested, and his conspiracy was dismantled before it could trigger civil war. The council voted, and it was not unanimous, but it was decisive, and Vakris was found guilty of treason and embezzlement and conspiracy to commit genocide, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment in a facility where he could never again threaten the empire. In the aftermath, the treaty was renegotiated, and not to remove human oversight, but to transform it into a true partnership, and Lisa became the first human ambassador to the Veltharan Empire and would work alongside Lysandra instead of over her. The new agreement included cultural exchange, programs and joint military exercises and shared scientific research, and it created a framework for cooperation that both species could respect. Amy was promoted to diplomatic liaison and would coordinate between both governments, and she looked forward to the challenge. 6 months later, Lisa visited Lysandra's private chambers, and the Queen and Nethys were reviewing star charts for a joint exploration mission into uncharted space, and they were planning to send both human and Veltharan crews into regions that neither species had explored. Lysandra poured 2 glasses of Veltharan star wine, and the liquid glowed with soft light, and she handed one to Lisa and finally made good on that promised drink. She said that when Lisa first arrived, she had thought about having Nethys eat her, and Lisa laughed and said that she had known and had filed that possibility under probable outcomes in her mission report. The dragon rumbled with amusement, and the sound was like distant thunder and warm and surprisingly gentle. They toasted to the future, and not one where humans ruled over Veltharans, or Veltharans over humans, but one where both species stood together against the darkness between stars. Lisa said that the treaty had always been meant to be a bridge instead of a chain, and Lysandra admitted that it had taken her far too long to understand that, as Lisa prepared to leave, Nethys said that for a human she had been an excellent choice, and the dragon's tone suggested that this was high praise. Indeed, Lysandra walked Lisa to the door, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence, and the Queen said that she was glad the treaty had brought them together, even if the circumstances had been difficult. Lisa said that the best alliances were forged in fire and tested by adversity, and that she looked forward to continuing their work together. She walked across the palace grounds, and her silhouette was framed by alien stars and 3 moons that hung in the violet sky, and she thought about how far they had all come. Lysandra watched from her window and allowed herself a small smile, and she thought about how some treaties were written in ink, and some were forged in fire, and the best ones were built on respect earned through trial and hardship. This treaty had begun as a source of shame and anger, but had become something precious, and it might just save them all from the dangers that lurked in the vast darkness of space. The Empire and humanity would face those dangers together, and that made all the difference.